the body's broken up into meridians according to yoga and also to chi, and so the energy paths and they're broken up into meridians, and they have to do with the cycles of the 24-hour day. And the Anger Meridian is from 3 a.m. to 5 a.m. And one time I was having a massage with this fabulous therapist who's he's kind of like a seer in some ways. He's from El Salvador, and he said, "Do you wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning every night, and are you unable to go back to sleep?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, that's the Anger Meridian. That's the lung meridian, and it's also where we keep all our anger. So if you wake up at 3, you can't go back to sleep, probably till around 5 or 6. But if you wake up at 2, you can go right back to sleep." And he was absolutely right. And I thought about that for a long time, and I thought, no wonder I carried anger around so long about my mother and her drinking that, I took it in the chest, and I always had bronchitis. And so that all sort of made sense on this kind of symbolic level. And I thought it was a really interesting title. That it's also the idea, I was thinking of Cormac McCarthy, who, in Blood Meridian says there are certain meridians that once you pass over them, you can never go back. Certain life experiences that once you've crossed over, you can never go back to the way it was before. I guess he's talking about innocence and experience. And that's what happens in the book. There's an episode that where she transgresses over the line and is unable to take it back. The novel takes place in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico, mostly. It starts in Dallas, Texas, but then it ends up in Mexico. And it's a Disney World for grown-ups. San Miguel de Allende has become this kind of playground for American retirees in a lot of cases, people with a lot of money to spend. And, it's also the place where Jack Kerouac and all those guys used to hang out down there in the 50s, and it was a kind of very, very quiet, very inaccessible town. It's in the mountains in the Sierra Madres, and it takes a long time to get there. So it was kind of a hippie hangout for a long time, and then it was sort of discovered by Texans, and it's grown enormous. It's like the Hamptons now. It's full of McMansions, and it's completely changed, and it's not the quiet little town it was even 15 years ago. I had a friend who lived there, and it just seemed to me like a really interesting place to set a novel where there's a lot of just natural tension between the sort of local population and the Americans who come down to retire and to live there. It's also a very interesting and strange place because a lot of Americans go down there for a vacation for a week or two and end up buying a house and selling everything in the States and moving down there. It's called the San Miguel bug. People actually do this and I've met many people who go down there and say, "This is for me," and they sell everything and move down there. So that was also a very interesting idea for me, the concept of somebody going down there and then never leaving. There's a lot of tension too, I think, with the kind of local population working for the American expatriates that come down there. It's interesting, the grandmother, the mother of the main character who's telling the story, who's an unreliable narrator who does a lot of lying, especially around her mother, that character is somewhat like my mother in certain ways. My mother was very funny, and she had this really biting sense of humor and was very entertaining and the life of the party. Everybody loved her. But if you were the brunt of her anger or her attacks, she could be extremely mean and difficult. So that's kind of the line that this mother walks. But I based her more on the mother of a friend of mine. This woman had 4 children and 4 stepchildren. And she was very beautiful and very intelligent, but she ran she was like the Red Queen, She sort of would yell, "Off with their heads," and everybody sort of protected her, and she said crazy things and could be very mean and could get very drunk, but she was protected by this sort of brood of kids. And that's what I feel about the mother here, is that she's all her life gotten away with being cruel because nobody's ever stopped her. Nobody's ever said to her, you can't act that way, you can't talk to people that way. And I think that's a very interesting character, somebody who's never been stopped, somebody who's so profoundly spoiled that she's never had to be accountable for any of her actions or her behavior. And when the narrator gets down there, her mother is sort of involved with a much younger guy who's he's supposed to be a student at the university, but he's not really. He's just living with her, and he's this sort of brooding philosophy student. And apparently there's something going on. And in San Miguel, that's often the case where rich American ladies who are either widowed or divorced go down there, and a lot of men too go down there and you know, have relationships with much younger men. And that's sort of very common down there and sort of very accepted. And that adds another dimension of sort of tension in the family, because the mother keeps threatening to leave all her money to the young Mexican guy. If I had to get out of Dodge really fast and I had a large amount of money to hide, I think hiding the money in a, well, now that I'm saying this, you'll be looking for it, I'm sure, in this place, but now that my daughter's grown up, you won't find it. But I think the battery compartment of a toy is a very good place to hide money, because really nobody would think to look there. And actually, when I was little, my dad used to sneak Cuban cigars out of places where you could get Cuban cigars, and he'd give my brother and me each a box wrapped with like children's paper and bows, and he'd say, carry this is a present for you, you just carry that through this line here where we're going to show our passports, and then when we get to the other side you can open it. So we'd be all excited with our presents, and we'd walk through customs with our presents under our arms, and we get to the other side and he'd say, give that back, and he'd take it back, and it was his cigars. I think most unreliable narrators build a wall around a certain myth that they're trying to protect, and each unreliable narrator has a different mythology. And I think in this case, in this book, the narrator is trying to maintain the myth that her mother loves her and that she loves her mother, and that's a really painful realization to come to eventually, that my mother really doesn't love me. I'm not the person that she wanted me to be. And I think that's the main primal wound that this character has. And I think in Claire Massoud's book, The Woman Upstairs, it's the idea that at 37, a woman is useless and abandoned, and that this woman does not want to ever be useless and abandoned. She wants to be important and loved and cared for. And I think that's the primal moving force in that book. So, you know, to me, that's the most interesting part of this book, is this: my mother's a wonderful person. My mother loves me. My mother is my mother is very protective of me, and she loves me so much. And when that myth starts to crack, the narrator starts to fall apart.